Sarah stood at the kitchen sink, staring blankly out the window as the late afternoon sun painted golden streaks across the worn linoleum floor. Outside, the world carried on as if nothing had changed, neighbors chatting by their cars, children racing their bicycles down the street. But inside her father's modest, two-bedroom house, time had come to a grinding halt. The faint sound of the television droned from the living room, where her father lay on the couch, too weak to get up. It had been 3 months since her father's health took a sharp decline. At first, Sarah thought it was just fatigue or maybe the flu, but the symptoms didn't go away. He began losing weight, his appetite vanished, and simple tasks like walking to the mailbox became Herculean efforts. The diagnosis had been both a relief and a curse: heart failure. At least now they knew what was wrong, but the road ahead would be anything but easy. Sarah, the youngest of 2 siblings, had always been the caretaker of the family. Her mother passed away when she was in high school, leaving a void Sarah instinctively filled by helping around the house and looking after her father. Her older brother, Mark, had left for college shortly after their mother's death, visiting sporadically over the years. While Sarah stayed close to home, finishing her degree at a nearby university and building a quiet life in the same town, Mark had chased opportunities in the city, climbing the corporate ladder and boasting about his achievements at family gatherings. When their father's condition worsened, it was Sarah who stepped in without hesitation. She adjusted her work schedule to accommodate his medical appointments, learned how to manage his complex medication regimen, and spent countless hours researching ways to make his home more accessible. At first, she didn't mind. This was her father, after all. But as the weeks turned into months, the weight of responsibility began to crush her. She had tried to reach out to Mark early on, hoping he would share the burden. "Dad's not doing well," she said during one of their rare phone calls. "He's going to need a lot of care, and I can't do it all on my own." Mark's response had been predictably nonchalant. "I'm really tied up at work right now, Sarah. You know how demanding my job is. I'll see what I can do, but you're already there, so it makes sense for you to handle it for now." Those words replayed in Sarah's mind like a broken record as she scrubbed the plate in her hands. 3 months later, Mark hadn't so much as visited. He called occasionally, offering vague promises of coming down soon or sending money to help with expenses, but the latter never materialized. The tipping point came one afternoon when Sarah, scrolling through social media during a rare moment of quiet, stumbled upon a photo of Mark. He was at a rooftop bar with colleagues, grinning broadly, a glass of champagne in hand. The caption read, "Celebrating another big win with the best team in the business." Sarah's chest tightened as she stared at the photo. The timing was unmistakable. He had posted it on the same day she had called him in tears, begging for help after a particularly grueling week of caring for their father. She had spent that night cleaning up after her father had a dizzy spell and knocked over a glass of water, leaving shards scattered across the floor. Her back still ached from crouching to clean it up, her nerves frayed from hours of worrying he might fall again. She closed the app and set her phone down with trembling hands. It wasn't just the photo, it was the growing realization that Mark had no intention of stepping up. He had escaped the confines of their family's struggles long ago and had no interest in looking back. That evening, as she helped her father into bed, Sarah decided to confront Mark directly. She didn't want to sound accusatory, just firm enough to make him understand how much she was handling alone. After her father was settled, she stepped outside and dialed Mark's number. "Hey, Sarah," he answered after a few rings, his voice cheerful. "What's up?" She took a deep breath, trying to keep her voice steady. "Mark, we need to talk. I'm drowning here. Dad needs constant care, and I can't keep doing this alone. I need you to come home and help." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Mark finally spoke, his tone had shifted to something colder, more detached. "Sarah, I told you I'm really busy right now. I can't just drop everything and come back. I've got responsibilities here." "And I don't," she snapped, surprising herself with the sharpness of her tone. "Mark, I'm working full-time, managing Dad's appointments, making his meals, cleaning the house. Do you have any idea how hard this is? You're his son, too. This isn't just my job." Mark sighed heavily. "Look, I get it. It's tough. But you've always been better at this kind of thing than me. You're patient, and you know how to handle Dad. Honestly, I'd probably just get in the way." Sarah clenched her fist around the phone. "That's a cop-out, and you know it. This isn't about who's better at caregiving, it's about doing what's right." "I'm sorry you feel that way," Mark said, his voice void of any real apology. "But I can't change my situation right now. Maybe in a few months things will calm down, and I'll be able to visit." "Maybe in a few months?" Sarah echoed, her voice breaking. "Dad might not have a few months, Mark. Do you even care?" The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, Mark muttered something about needing to get back to work and ended the call. Sarah stood on the porch, the cool evening air doing little to soothe her raw nerves. Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had spent too many nights crying over Mark's indifference, and she was done. Later that night, after her father had fallen asleep, Sarah sat down at the kitchen table and opened her laptop. She needed to take control of the situation, with or without Mark's help. She began researching local support groups for caregivers, hoping to find a community that could offer guidance or at least a sympathetic ear. As she scrolled through forums and articles, she stumbled upon a thread about family dynamics and caregiving. One comment stood out: "Sometimes the people we rely on the most are the ones who let us down. You can't change them, but you can choose how to respond." The words resonated with Sarah. She couldn't force Mark to care, but she could stop letting his absence dictate her emotional well-being. With a newfound determination, she began drafting a list of tasks she could outsource: groceries, cleaning, even occasional caregiving shifts if she could afford it. If Mark wouldn't step up, she would find other ways to lighten her load. By the time she went to bed, Sarah felt a small spark of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep her going. The days blurred together for Sarah as she juggled her full-time job and the relentless demands of caring for her father. Her mornings started before sunrise, helping her father get dressed, preparing his breakfast, and ensuring he took his medications on time. By the time she clocked in for work at her remote customer service job, she was already running on fumes. Evenings were no better, cleaning up after her father's meals, assisting him to the bathroom, and keeping him company as he drifted off to sleep. It was an exhausting routine with no end in sight. Mark, meanwhile, remained a ghost. His calls grew less frequent, and when he did bother to check in, the conversations were brief and empty. Sarah tried to give him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he was truly busy. Maybe he didn't realize just how much she was struggling. But deep down, she knew the truth: Mark didn't care enough to help. Her frustration reached a boiling point one Friday evening. It had been a particularly rough week. Her father had fallen twice while trying to get to the bathroom, and Sarah was terrified that the next fall could break a bone or worse. She had spent hours on the phone with his doctor, discussing the possibility of installing a home health aide, but the cost was overwhelming. As she scrolled through her phone in bed, hoping to distract herself with mindless entertainment, she stumbled upon another social media post from Mark. This time, he was at a luxury resort, lounging by a pool with a cocktail in hand. The caption read, "Work hard, play harder. A little RR after a killer quarter." Sarah felt a wave of anger so intense it made her stomach churn. She stared at the photo, her fingers trembling. While she was sacrificing her time, her energy, and her emotional well-being to care for their father, Mark was living a life of luxury, completely unbothered by the responsibilities he had so conveniently shirked. She debated calling him right then and there, but it was late, and she doubted he would pick up. Instead, she took a screenshot of the post and saved it, a silent reminder of just how little he cared. The next day, Sarah's patience finally snapped. She was running on 3 hours of sleep after spending most of the night helping her father through a coughing fit. Her head throbbed, and her body felt like it was made of lead. As she sat at the kitchen table, sipping a lukewarm cup of coffee, her father called out from the living room. "Sarah, can you help me with the remote?" She clenched her jaw, setting the mug down harder than she intended. It wasn't her father's fault he couldn't help needing her assistance. But the constant demands, the lack of any respite, and Mark's glaring absence had worn her down to the point of breaking. "Just a minute, Dad," she called back, her voice strained. Instead of getting up immediately, she grabbed her phone and dialed Mark's number. It rang several times before going to voicemail. Of course. She hung up and tried again, this time leaving a message. "Mark, it's me. I need to talk to you. Call me back as soon as you can. It's important." Hours passed, and there was no response. By the time evening rolled around, Sarah was seething. She tried calling again, but this time Mark picked up on the second ring. "Hey, Sarah," he said, his voice chipper. What's up? She took a deep breath, trying to keep her composure. Mark, I left you a message earlier. Did you not listen to it? Oh yeah, sorry about that. I've been swamped today. What's going on? What's going on? She repeated, her voice rising despite her best efforts to stay calm. Mark, do you have any idea what my life looks like right now? Dad needs help constantly, he can't do anything on his own anymore. I'm doing everything, and I'm completely burned out. I need you to come home and help. This isn't something I can keep doing by myself. Mark sighed, and she could almost picture him rubbing his temples in exasperation. Sarah, we've talked about this. I'm really busy with work. I can't just drop everything and come back. My job is demanding, and it's not like I can take time off whenever I want. And you think my job isn't demanding? She shot back. Mark, I'm working full-time too. On top of that, I'm basically a full-time caregiver. I'm not asking you to quit your job, I'm asking you to step up and share the responsibility. Look, Mark said, his tone clipped, I get that you're stressed, but you're there, Sarah. You're better at this than I am. Honestly, I'd probably just make things harder if I tried to help. Sarah laughed bitterly. That's the lamest excuse I've ever heard. This isn't about who's better at caregiving, it's about doing what's right. He's your father too, Mark. Don't you care about him at all? Of course I care, Mark snapped. But I have a life, Sarah. I can't just put everything on hold. And I can? She shot back, her voice cracking. Mark, I haven't had a life since this started. Do you know how many times I've canceled plans, skipped meals, lost sleep all because I'm doing this alone? I'm drowning here, and you don't even care enough to lift a finger. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, Mark spoke, his voice icy. I don't appreciate being guilt-tripped, Sarah. I'm doing the best I can from where I am. If you can't handle it, maybe you should look into hiring someone. Sarah felt like she had been slapped. Hiring someone? With what money, Mark? You haven't contributed a single cent. Do you have any idea how much home care costs? That's not my problem, he said flatly. Look, I've got to go. We'll talk later. The call ended abruptly, leaving Sarah staring at her phone in disbelief. Her hands were shaking, and tears blurred her vision. She wanted to scream, to throw the phone across the room, but instead, she shoved it into her pocket and took a deep, shuddering breath. She couldn't keep doing this relying on Mark, hoping he would change. He had made it clear where he stood, and she was done wasting her energy on someone who refused to help. That night, as she lay awake in bed, Sarah made a decision. She would find another way to lighten her load, even if it meant asking for help from strangers. Mark might have abandoned their father, but she wouldn't. She wouldn't abandon herself either. Sarah woke up the next morning with a clear sense of purpose. The emotional storm of the previous night had passed, leaving behind a hard resolve. Mark's indifference stung, but it also pushed her to take matters into her own hands. For months, she had been trying to manage everything on her own, all while hoping her brother would finally step up. Now, she knew better. She couldn't waste any more time or energy on someone who had no intention of helping. She began her day as usual, preparing her father's breakfast and making sure he was comfortable. But as she stood in the kitchen stirring oatmeal, she mentally mapped out her plan. If Mark wouldn't contribute his time or money, she would find resources elsewhere. She needed support, whether from friends, the community, or even professional services. After settling her father in the living room with his favorite TV show, Sarah sat down at her laptop. She opened a blank document and began typing a list of priorities. 1. Find temporary caregiving assistance. 2. Research financial aid or subsidies for home care. 3. Reach out to local support groups for caregivers. It felt good to have a plan, even if she didn't know exactly how to execute it yet. Her first step was to look for professional caregiving services. She had dismissed the idea before, assuming it would be too expensive, but desperation pushed her to explore every option. She found several local agencies and began making calls. The first few conversations were discouraging. Most services charged far more than Sarah could afford, and many had long waiting lists. But on her fifth call, she finally got a glimmer of hope. We do offer sliding scale pricing based on income, the woman on the other end of the line explained. If you fill out an application and provide proof of income, we might be able to lower the cost for you. Sarah felt a surge of relief. That's great. What kind of care do you provide? We can send a caregiver for a few hours a day to help with meals, medication, and light housekeeping. It's not full-time care, but it can take some of the pressure off. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. Sarah scheduled an appointment to discuss the details and hung up, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. Her next step was to research financial assistance programs. She spent hours combing through government websites and community forums, jotting down every grant, subsidy, and charity she could find. The process was overwhelming. Every application seemed to require a mountain of paperwork, but Sarah was determined. In the meantime, she reached out to a local support group for caregivers. The group met weekly at a community center, and though the idea of sharing her struggles with strangers made her nervous, Sarah decided to attend. She needed to connect with people who understood what she was going through. The meeting was held in a small, cheerful room with a circle of folding chairs. Sarah arrived early, clutching a notebook and a pen. As others trickled in, she felt a pang of anxiety. Most of the attendees were older women in their 50s and 60s who had been caring for aging spouses or parents for years. Sarah felt out of place among them, but she reminded herself that they were all here for the same reason. When the meeting began, the group leader, a warm woman named Linda, encouraged everyone to share their experiences. One by one, the attendees spoke about their challenges and frustrations: sleepless nights, financial strain, ungrateful family members. When it was Sarah's turn, she hesitated, her throat tightening. "I'm Sarah," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I've been taking care of my dad for the past few months. He has heart failure, and he can't really do much on his own anymore. It's been hard. I work full-time, and I'm the only one taking care of him. My brother," she paused, unsure if she wanted to reveal the full extent of Mark's negligence. "My brother doesn't help. At all." There were murmurs of sympathy around the room. One woman leaned forward, her expression kind. "That sounds so tough, Sarah. Do you have any support?" Sarah shook her head. "Not really. I'm trying to figure out how to get help, but it feels like there's just so much to do." Linda smiled gently. "You've already taken the first step by coming here. Sometimes just talking about it can make a big difference." By the end of the meeting, Sarah felt a small but significant sense of relief. She exchanged phone numbers with a few of the attendees who promised to share resources and advice. For the first time in weeks, she felt less alone. Back at home, Sarah put her newfound energy into action. She filled out applications for financial aid, scheduled follow-up appointments with caregiving agencies, and even started reorganizing the house to make it more accessible for her father. Small changes, like moving his favorite chair closer to the bathroom and installing grab bars, made a noticeable difference. A few days later, Sarah received a surprise visit from her Aunt Carol, her father's younger sister. Carol had heard about their situation through the family grapevine and came by to see how she could help. "Why didn't you call me sooner?" Carol asked, hugging Sarah tightly. "I didn't want to burden anyone," Sarah admitted. "Nonsense," Carol said firmly. "Family is supposed to be there for each other. I can't believe Mark hasn't been helping. That boy needs a wake-up call." Carol offered to take over some of the caregiving duties, at least a few days a week. Though she lived in a neighboring town, she was retired and had the time to spare. Sarah felt a lump in her throat as she thanked her aunt. It was the first time someone had truly stepped up to help. With Carol's assistance and the prospect of hiring a part-time caregiver, Sarah finally began to see a way forward. She still had moments of frustration and exhaustion, but the burden no longer felt insurmountable. One evening, as she sat with her father watching an old Western movie, he turned to her and smiled weakly. "You're a good daughter, Sarah," he said, his voice soft but sincere. Tears pricked her eyes, but she managed to smile. "I'm just doing what anyone would do, Dad." "Not everyone," he replied, his gaze distant. "Not everyone." Sarah knew he was thinking about Mark, but she didn't press the issue. Instead, she squeezed his hand, feeling a mix of sadness and gratitude. She couldn't control her brother's choices, but she could choose how to respond. By the end of the week, Sarah had finalized plans with the caregiving agency, scheduled regular visits from Carol, and even joined an online support group recommended by the women at the meeting. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was progress. Mark might not have been there for their father, but Sarah was. And that, she realized, was what truly mattered. The days after Sarah's decision to take charge of the situation brought a mixture of relief and new challenges. With her Aunt Carol helping a few days a week, and the part-time caregiver arriving regularly, Sarah finally had moments to breathe. She used this newfound time to tackle neglected areas of her life, reconnecting with friends, enjoying quiet moments of solitude, and even allowing herself the rare indulgence of a full night's sleep. But while Sarah's immediate circumstances improved, the underlying tension with her brother Mark remained unresolved. His continued absence and refusal to contribute weighed on her, not because she needed his help anymore, but because his actions or lack thereof symbolized a deeper fracture in their family. Sarah had begun attending the caregiver support group regularly, and one evening, after a particularly enlightening session, she found herself contemplating the nature of forgiveness. Several group members had shared stories about estranged siblings or ungrateful children, and while their tales often ended in reconciliation, Sarah wasn't sure she could take the same path. How could she forgive someone who showed no remorse? The next day, she received a call from Carol. Her aunt had been quietly reaching out to other family members, trying to rally support for Sarah and her father. "I talked to Mark," Carol said, her tone cautious. Sarah froze. "You what?" "I called him. He needed to hear the truth, Sarah. About how hard this has been for you and for your dad. He had no idea you were looking into financial aid or bringing in caregivers. He thought you had it all under control." Sarah's stomach churned. Of course he thought that. "He didn't care enough to ask." "I know, sweetie. But I also think he's been avoiding the situation because he feels guilty. He admitted he's been scared to come back and face everything." "That's a nice excuse," Sarah said bitterly. Carol sighed. "It's not an excuse, Sarah. It's an explanation. I'm not saying it makes up for what he's done or hasn't done, but maybe it's a starting point." Sarah didn't respond, unsure of what to say. 2 days later, Mark showed up unannounced. Sarah was in the middle of folding laundry when the doorbell rang. She opened the door to find her brother standing there, holding a bottle of wine and looking sheepish. "Hey," he said. Sarah stared at him, unsure if she was more shocked or angry. "What are you doing here? Can I come in?" She stepped aside reluctantly, crossing her arms as he entered. Mark set the wine bottle on the kitchen counter and turned to face her. "Look," he began, "I know I've been a crappy brother. And a crappy son. Aunt Carol called me out, and honestly, she was right. I should have been here. I should have helped." Sarah raised an eyebrow. What changed? Mark ran a hand through his hair, sighing. "I don't know." Hearing it from her made it feel real. Like I couldn't ignore it anymore. I saw how much she cared, and it made me realize how little I've done. Sarah felt her anger bubbling to the surface. "You're right, you've done nothing, Mark. Do you have any idea what it's been like? Watching Dad decline, trying to balance work and caregiving, feeling like I'm drowning every single day?" "I know," he said softly. "I mean, I don't really know, but I can imagine. And I hate that I left you to deal with it alone." Sarah scoffed. "So what now? You think you can just show up with a bottle of wine and a half-hearted apology, and everything will be fine?" "No," Mark said, meeting her gaze. "I know it's not that simple. But I want to make it right. I want to help Sarah. If you'll let me." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Sarah's mind raced with conflicting emotions: anger, skepticism, hope. Could she trust him? Did he really mean it? Or was this just another empty gesture? Finally, she sighed. "If you're serious about helping, there's plenty to do. But I'm not going to hold my breath, Mark. You've let us down before." "I get it," he said, his voice steady. "And I don't blame you for not trusting me. But I'm here now. Just tell me what to do." Over the next few weeks, Mark slowly began to prove himself. He took over weekend caregiving duties, giving Sarah a chance to rest and recharge. He handled the grocery shopping and started contributing financially, even paying for the caregiver's next month of services. At first, Sarah remained guarded, waiting for him to flake or disappear again. But as the weeks turned into months, she saw a genuine change in her brother. He was more present, more involved, and more willing to shoulder the responsibility he had long avoided. Their father, too, seemed to notice the difference. One evening, as Mark helped him adjust his blankets, he smiled and said, "It's good to have you here, son." Mark looked at Sarah, his expression tinged with guilt and gratitude. "It's good to be here, Dad." For Sarah, the road to forgiveness was not a straight line. There were days when resentment crept back in, when she remembered all the times Mark had let her down. But there were also moments of connection, like when they worked together to plan their father's birthday, or when Mark stayed up late to comfort their dad during a particularly bad night that reminded her of the bond they once shared. The breakthrough came one afternoon when Sarah found Mark sitting on the porch, staring at an old family photo. She sat down beside him, and for a while, neither of them spoke. "I was scared," Mark admitted finally. "Scared of losing him. Scared of not being good enough. So I ran. And in running, I hurt both of you." Sarah swallowed hard, her throat tight. "You did hurt us. But you're here now, and that means something." Mark turned to her, his eyes earnest. "Do you think we'll ever be okay again?" She considered the question carefully. "Maybe not the way we were before, but we can find a new kind of okay." As the seasons changed, so did their family dynamic. Their father's health remained fragile, but the load no longer felt unbearable. Sarah and Mark learned to rely on each other, rebuilding trust one small act at a time. When their father passed away peacefully a year later, they stood side by side at the funeral, holding each other up through the grief. And as they looked around at the family and friends who had come to pay their respects, Sarah felt a sense of closure. Mark squeezed her hand. "Thank you for not giving up on me." She smiled through her tears. "Thank you for coming back." It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was real, and for Sarah that was enough.